The next topic we wanted to discuss was just a bit of a meta trend we've observed. I wrote a post about it actually 6 months ago, and we haven't had a chance to get to it yet. And I was suggesting there that there's a kind of a meta trend going on. If you think about NASA and the US government being reliant on Elon and SpaceX, and you think about data centers looking to support AI workloads are reliant on NVIDIA and in turn TSMC and Taiwan. If you look at AI apps, especially Microsoft at the time was reliant on OpenAI, and OpenAI was going through the management changes. And actually, to take it into a political direction, you could argue that the US is perceived to be, or perceives itself to be, reliant on Israel in terms of having a peer in the Middle East and having a foothold there. All of these, and I'm sure many more, are a kind of key man risk or key vendor risk, where there's kind of a single source vendor that is causing, maybe is unstable or unsure or on weird footing. And the dependent or client states are like, whoa, hang on a second. We need to hold on to this for dear life. NASA and the US government can't really tag Elon with much, right? They need SpaceX, they need Starlink. You can't really do much with NVIDIA right now. Everyone needs their GPUs, right? Taiwan, we can't really let China take Taiwan, right? This is a really big problem. And at the time, when Microsoft was dealing with OpenAI, Satya's famously said, hey, we're below them, above them, beside them. We are totally fine. We've got control of everything here. OpenAI, we don't need it. But they sort of needed it. And they were sort of reliant on OpenAI during that time. And one could argue still to this day. So I think this key vendor risk is an interesting meta trend that I'm noticing, and it's causing a lot of angst, consternation, weird political machinations, weird tolerance of things that maybe these other entities wouldn't have tolerated, on and on.
I don't actually think it's a new phenomenon. I just think that the playing field has shifted. So whenever there is a concentration of a really valuable resource within one or a handful of major players, those players have a lot of leverage, and that can cause risk. And so, you mentioned the Middle East before. I'll actually mention it in a different way, which is in the context of oil. For a long period in the 20th century through to the early 21st century, the Middle East had, I won't say a monopoly, but they had a vast majority of the world's oil supply, which gave them a lot of power. And they formed OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was largely Middle Eastern, to use that leverage. And you could argue that US policy towards Saudi Arabia, like Saudi Arabia is opening up these days, but in the past it was a very, very repressive regime. And the US always treated it as an ally. Why? Because it was the world's major oil producer. And so, I think this interplay between geopolitics and resources has always existed, Chris. I just think that it's like, okay, oil's a perfect example because the fracking boom has actually made, I believe it was this year that the US crossed to become the world's largest oil producer from Saudi Arabia. And so correspondingly, those countries have lost some of their leverage. And I think that's been good for sort of Western geopolitical bloc. Now we're in a situation where, okay, oil, sure, it's still important. But what else is important is chip manufacturing. It is compute. It is things like that. And so the places where those concentrations have happened have moved, right? It's moved to the Netherlands where ASML are. It's moved to Taiwan where TSMC is. And, there are various other things where you sort of see that concentration. That is very dangerous. And the natural response to that, again, is diversification. Those who feel the geopolitical pressure will be encouraged to diversify. And, the US passed the CHIPS Act. It's called the CHIPS Act. They always stand for something stupid. But the idea is to bring some of that silicon manufacturing capability onshore into the US. Until that happens, Taiwan, which is already a global geographic flashpoint because of PRC's claims to that island, I think the existence of TSMC manufacturing all of the world's high-end chips have simply made that worse. And yeah, it's really risky. It's kind of bad for everyone in the end, except in a very narrow sense for those who control that resource, but usually even they end up getting harmed by that concentration. So I agree. I think it's the first time we really see it in the tech space rather than in the sort of the second wave economy of the 20th century. And it's something that urgently needs to be dealt with.
It's interesting. You talked about Middle East and oil. I was talking to someone about this impending collapse of the US dollar because of the exclusivity lapsing on using the US dollar as the petrodollar, blah, 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 and the alignment against the US dollar. And
it's just a load of bollocks. These conspiracy theories just give me the shit. Sorry.
I believe there is actually exploration of certain things that might weaken the US's position, the US dollar's position as the de facto standard for purchasing petroleum and so on. Whether that ends up happening or not is a whole other different story, and whether that ends up mattering or not is a whole other different story. But the point I was going to make is what's interesting is tokens are the new oil, right? And so while there's like maybe a shift in how these dynamics play out for oil, and oil, as you said, remains very, very important, and we're not suggesting that otherwise, but there's now a new factor that drives the supremacy of the US dollar, which is token manufacturing. And so I think that's an interesting phenomena. You only get your GPUs from NVIDIA, powered by TSMC, but created by NVIDIA, designed and distributed and sold by NVIDIA. That's a really interesting dynamic. And the thing that just strikes me, and this is not new, what feels new is the number of facets, the number of ways there is this key vendor risk happening all at the same time, and how obvious and transparent the resulting compromise of principles and the behavior in terms of these clients that are depending on these vendors are kind of twisting themselves into a pretzel and in many ways acting against their best interests in every other way in order to maintain a tenuous link with the vendor. Elon not being called out by the SEC, there's kind of limits to what the SEC can do against him, I believe. There are limits to how little involvement the US can have with Taiwan, even if they choose to not honor their treaty. It's absolutely critical. There are limits to what can happen to NVIDIA. And there are limits actually to what the US government will allow to happen to Israel. Across the board, it feels like there are many more examples of this all at the same time. And it feels like the corruption of principles, the compromise of principles, the twisting into pretzels is becoming more obvious because like everyone's able to see it happening in real time. And I feel like people are a bit more savvy to it. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon.
I don't know, man. Call me weirdly an optimist on this. I think a combination of free markets and sovereign self-interest helps to resolve this, right? Yes, there is Starlink. There are now other satellite networks going up. Maybe one day there will be viable competition for Starlink. Similarly, for chip manufacturing, I mentioned the CHIPS Act. TSMC are starting a plant in the US. Similarly, for foundation models, OpenAI owned it all, and now we've got a bunch of companies who are in the mix with similarly powerful models. And so I think that the general path when there is this sort of monopoly and this choke point is that the world figures out a way to move away from it.
But I think this is related to the labor discussion we had before, which is there's what is historically true. You want to avoid saying this time is different because it's never different. But this time, the capital requirements, the lead times, the power laws, the virtuous cycles and flywheels feel like they are steeper than ever. It's really hard to spin up fabs. It's really hard to spin up Starlink. It's really hard to collect all the world's best engineers for an OpenAI and kind of get the kind of lead that they have, or NVIDIA have the kind of lead that they have with their deep, deep integration across software and hardware. These are deep moats. I mean, it's really hard to spin up a new country in the Middle East, right? Like, these are deep moats. Of course, what you're saying, Yaniv, is like on the long arc of history, people who have panicked about changes to the labor market, changes to single source vendors have been proven wrong, right? Like these things sort themselves out over the long arc of history. And it's very likely this will happen again. If you want a betting man or a betting woman, that's what you'd bet on. I just think it's worth pointing out to the listeners and observing the number of these things happening at the same time, the obviousness by which there seems to be a kind of a corruption of principles happening in public, kind of naked corruption of principles, and just the kind of the rate of change and the deep moats around each of these single source vendors. I think it's an interesting phenomenon, an interesting time we're in right now.
It's a very fair point. And I also, to agree with you here, it's never been the case that so many of these choke points have been in private hands rather than government hands, which is another thing that makes it very interesting.
All right, that's our thoughts about this key vendor risk and how it might be driving some corruption and weird outcomes in the world. What do you think about this? We want to know. Join us in the comments and let us know your thoughts.